Welcome to Season 2, Episode 14 of The Thursday Show. I am your host, Paul Miles. Thank you so much for tuning in. We've been going through a series on the book of Genesis, and this week we will be discussing Genesis chapter 6, wherein we see the increasing wickedness of man, which leads up to the need for a global flood. Genesis chapter 6 begins when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were fair, and took as wives any they chose. Okay, this raises a few questions. Who are the sons of God, and who are the daughters of men? There are four basic schools of thought here that have been proposed. One would be that the sons of God are polygamous despots who are raising up and taking a bunch of wives for them. However, we see that the result of this breeding is called Nephilim, mighty men. We would not anticipate that such verbiage would be used about human arrangements. Also, polygamy was quite the norm, not only in the case of Cain and his lineage, which we saw in chapter 4, but we even see this among righteous men falling into what I would say is a sin of polygamy, in the cases of Abraham, even further down to David and so forth. So I don't think that polygamy is in mind here. I don't think that it's any men marrying women. That's the first three. What they have in common is that it's humans marrying women, right? So we have polygamous despots, men marrying women more generally, and the third is the godly line of Seth is in my mind here. Like I say, these three views fall short because I think there's more demonic activity in mind. As far as the godly line of Seth being in mind here, I think there are some shortcomings there as well. There have been attempts, especially in chapter 4, to try to push racial agendas into the line of Cain. So some would try to say that there is a godly line here that the ungodly line of Cain is trying to intermingle with. I don't think that's quite true. That's not indicated anywhere in the text. Of course, I mentioned some racial tones to that. I found a Mormon journal that Latter-day Saints wrote back in the 19th century that originally Adam and Eve were white. They had white children, and Cain was born white, and then whenever he sinned, he was given a mark, which was black skin. And that somehow or another, Cain is in mind here, that the lineage of Cain is bringing black blood into the white lineage, which they would often eventually say was carried over on the ark and brought into the lineage of Ham. Then the curse of Ham authorizes whites to enslave blacks. This is absolute heresy. I would challenge you to find any heresy greater than this one, which is rooted in a false view of the book of Genesis that has done any more harm to the North American continent than that one. It's not just restricted to racism against blacks, by the way. I have found pieces where the same was said, but from the perspective that Adam and Eve were originally black and went on to have kids. Cain turned white whenever he sinned, and then that was carried on. That is an entirely racial propaganda. It is a sinful way of thinking that has resulted in bad biblical interpretation, which has resulted in even more sin in the form of racial tension, especially in North America. But we see racial tension all over the world, right? These particular forms have become manifest in the West. Okay, so what's going on here? It's probably not polygamous despots. It's not just men marrying women. It's not the godly line of Seth being contaminated. I would hold to a fourth view, which would say that these are fallen angels who are coming and infiltrating man's genealogy, if you will. I think that Satan is very much involved throughout the opening chapters of Genesis all the way to the latter parts of Revelation. And he is particularly invested in trying to thwart the serpent crusher, which we came across back in Genesis 3. How does he do this? Well, first we see in the narrative of Genesis 4 with Cain and Abel, Cain killing his brother. I tend to think that was a something that Satan would have been very well pleased with if he could somehow or another kill the Messiah's great 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 grandfather as soon as he could, then the Messiah would not come. Of course, Satan failed quite miserably at that. The Messiah has come once already, and he will come again. So by the time we get a little bit further down, it seems that Satan is trying to corrupt the seed of man entirely. And it looks like the tactic that he is using is by having fallen angels take the form of humans in order to have sexual relations with women in order to corrupt the seed so that it's no longer plain men, but rather fallen angel human hybrids. Now, what's the reason for saying this? First of all, we have the term the sons of God. Where else do we see this term? Well, we see it in the introduction of the book of Job, right? When the sons of God came to present themselves. And this is a clear reference to Satan and the fallen angels around him. Some would object and say, well, the angels are a different kind from humans. They are not within the human created kind, not a bara min, a created kind along with humans, therefore they cannot reproduce. And so some would say it's not fallen angels taking the forms of humans, rather it is fallen angels who are possessing humans in order to corrupt the lineage. Problem with that is it does resolve this question of one kind being able to reproduce with another if they're both in the same kind. However, the offspring would still be full-blooded humans. So I don't think that's quite right. Whenever we see angels becoming manifest, they are typically represented as male, so not female. Notice it is the sons of God going into the daughters of men, so the men are fallen angels, I think. We also see cases where angels are able to eat, for example, with other humans here on Earth. Now, if they have the equipment, the bodily functions for consuming food and drink, you would suppose then that they also have the equipment for eliminating food and drink. So the organs would be intact for this sort of thing. So I would tend to think that this is indeed fallen angels and human women. Okay, so we are seeing demons try to infiltrate the human genealogy. God does not like that. So what does he say next? Verse 3. The Lord said, my spirit will not always strive with man, for he is flesh, yet his days will be 120 years. Okay, what does this mean, 120 years? Some have proposed that that means that after the flood, within a few generations, we see that men are only living 120 years, and then it deteriorates even further. Some have said that man cannot live longer than 120 years now. I would disagree. I think we could take a different approach. It sounds like God is saying that 120 years from now, he is going to do something to destroy all flesh on the earth, which in the following verses we find out is the flood. So I think God is giving a clear timeline for when the destruction is going to take place, when this deluge is going to be. And so whenever Noah is building the ark and preaching and telling people they're asking, why are you building this boat? He can say, well, 120 years from now, God is going to destroy the earth with the flood. And as he built it, he could keep counting down. 119 years from now, 102 years, 80, 70, 60, all the way down. So the people knew it was coming. They had Noah declaring it this whole time. Verse 4, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days. And also after that, when the sons of God came to the daughters of men, they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. Okay, so here are the Nephilim, from whence we get the word fallen, right? That's what the word Nephilim means, the fallen ones. Let's see. They're called the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. Now, this is being written from the perspective of Moses, who is post-flood. So these apparently were men of renown, men who were still known after the flood, from the time before the flood. An interesting theory has been proposed about this. So prior to the flood, there were these hybrid angel-human beings that would have been mighty and of renown. Perhaps this flood, perhaps one of the big goals was to wipe out this particular group of beings, as well as wicked mankind. But on the ark, Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, as well as their wives, would have remembered these beings from old. Then whenever they came to the New World, they got off the ark, started to reproduce, told their children, eventually get the Tower of Babel, and then a dispersion. And it could be that these ancient beings were somehow turned into legends that sort of became legendary figures that we see in mythology. So it could be that certain nations, whenever they formed their man-made religions, were taking these historical figures from the past, making them into mythological forms, which they then turned into their pantheons. So that by the time Moses comes along, they're the men of renown, the men of old, which have been since turned into these mythological figures. Then I have some friends that would take this a step further and say, as we go on throughout history, these mythological figures form the basis for a lot of literature that develops, right? We still have great epics from the ancient pagan world that we read today, right? The Odyssey, the Iliad, for example. And then as you go further down history, other works of fiction and literature have come up that are kind of based, if you will, on the stories of old. What was it? That movie, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? Fun movie set in America during kind of the Dust Bowl, had a lot of music to it. Well, that's sort of based on the story of the Odyssey, which is an ancient Greek tale that integrates a lot of Greek mythology, which, according to this theory, would have its ultimate root in Genesis 6 and the hybrid fallen angels and humans. So we could say, in a way, that the cultural impact is still felt today, not only in the movie Oh Brother, We're Out There, but in so many stories that are built around uh, this fundamental hero on a journey that we see in the Odyssey. Or we even have, for example, in the comic books, we've got Thor and Loki. So we see the Norse gods being brought into comic books today. So that's an interesting theory. Whether or not that's how it worked out historically is a fun thing to think about. But nowhere in the pages of scripture are you going to find Spider-Man. So that's sort of conjecture. All right, moving forward. Genesis 6:5. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was continually only evil. The Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him in his heart. So the Lord said, I will destroy man, whom I have created, from the face of the earth, both man and beast, and the creeping things, and the birds of the sky, for I am sorry that I made them. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Now remember, God has already promised in Genesis 3 that we're going to have the seed of Eve come out and crush the serpent, which means we are going to have to continue to have a human race until that happens. So God's got to preserve someone if he's going to destroy the bulk of humanity. Genesis 6:9 begins, these are the generations of Noah. Now remember, whenever we see these are the generations of the book of Genesis, that's the Toledot, a structure which I believe is formed from various ancient family documents of history, which Moses recorded under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. So he was able to get all of this written down in a way that is inerrant. So it may not be a precise copy of what was original. If there were any errors in the original, then Moses did not carry any errors over because that process was done under the inspiration of God. So we have a new section that starts here. These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a just man and blameless among his contemporaries. Noah walked with God. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. The earth was corrupt before God and filled with violence, which is interesting. What do we see back in Genesis chapter 4? That God does not want man to go around killing each other. Yet the earth was filled with violence. God looked on the earth and saw it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. Well, wait a minute, this can't possibly be right, right? What do we see? That in the Garden of Eden, man is entirely innocent and told not to eat from the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Well, he does that. He eats from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and therefore he receives the knowledge of good and evil, a conscience, right? Well, ask any postmodern contemporary. We should all be living in accordance with our conscience. We should all be doing what is right in our own eyes. We should be following our heart like the blue fairy from Pinocchio told us to. And everything will be okay, right? Wrong. Here we have an example of what happens whenever man follows his own conscience. It ends in global corruption, wickedness, violence. It's not good. Your conscience is beneficial. It should help you to stay away from certain evils. If it does not, then your conscience is probably broken. However, the conscience is not sufficient to lead man in righteousness. Very important aspect. Every time we come to a dispensational shift, we need to say, okay, what went wrong? Right? That's what went wrong here. People followed their conscience, and it was insufficient. They followed their conscience into wickedness. Now, we can ask then, okay, why did God just allow man to live according to his conscience then? It did not surprise God that this is the result. Couldn't God have just interfered? Perhaps send the Messiah pronto to fix things up? My response to that would be that God is using these dispensations throughout time as something of an educational tool. This is a teachable moment, if you will. Suppose we skipped this dispensation. Okay. After this, we get into civil government. So suppose as soon as Adam and Eve sinned, God sent them out of the garden and said, okay, now here is the Noahic covenant. You don't know Noah yet, but he'll get here. And this is what you're supposed to do. one man sheds another man's blood, his blood should be demanded of him, right? And he gives them the basis of this civil government in which men are looking over each other. Okay, and then they go on, and then they do the Tower of Babel pronto right after that, and then the whole drama folds out with Abraham and everything. But we skip the dispensation of conscience. Okay, in theory, if that's the way it went down, then in the eternal state on the new heavens and new earth, in theory, as well as in the lake of fire, where people will be for eternity as well, folks could be thinking and theorizing and philosophizing. I tend to think there will be some philosophers in the eternal state. And in theory, if we did not have this dispensation, then the philosophers could sit there in their new Athens on the new earth and say, God gave man conscience after Adam and Eve fell. We all had the knowledge of good and evil. Had God simply allowed man to follow his own conscience, then things would have been okay. That would have been sufficient for us. We didn't necessarily need to have civil government, and we didn't necessarily need a Messiah. If only God would have allowed us to follow our conscience, then things would have been peachy. Postmodernism on the new earth, we could say. Okay. However, being as how we do indeed have a historical example of this, being as how God did let us, mankind, not me individually, I wasn't there, but being as how God did let man drive himself into a ditch by following his conscience, that is not an argument that can be made in eternity future, right? That's not something that anyone in hell can say. If only God let me follow my own conscience, I wouldn't have needed a savior. So I think that by the time we get through all of the dispensations, God will have allowed man to have several different modes of government. And I think we can look back on them all and say, yes, no matter what the dispensation is, man is far, far short of being able to earn God's righteousness. Okay, so man has followed his conscience, and now it's time to destroy him because things are so wicked. So God said to Noah, "The end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. Now I will destroy them with the earth." Notice he's not just destroying life, he's destroying the earth. He's doing some really, really damaging stuff to the planet. The planet's not going to look like it does after Noah, like it did before Noah. Right? Verse 14, make an ark of cypress wood for yourself. Now, this is the modern English version, which I happen to kind of like. This word cypress wood. Other translations will have gopher wood. Now, I kind of like gopher wood, not gopher like the animal. Gopher is just the transliteration of the Hebrew word. This word gopher wood is the material that the ark is made out of, and we don't really have a whole lot of information about it. We don't know what it was. Cypress is kind of a guess. It could be that gopher is a particular kind of tree. It could be that the tree went extinct in the flood. It could be that the tree went extinct since then. It could be that the tree is all around us. We just don't happen to know which one it is. It could also be that gopher wood means like treated wood or tooled wood. Cypress wood may be a good guess, but whenever we really, really, really don't know, I kind of like just sticking to the Hebrew with gopher wood. So make an ark of gopher wood for yourself. Make rooms in the ark and cover it inside and out with pitch. What is pitch? Pitch is, you take like some tree sap, kind of burn it, and it turns all sticky and gooey and waterproofy. It's not an element that you need death for. Some try to say it's like a fossil fuel of some sort. Not necessarily. You can make this out of tree sap. So it's going to be a lot of pitch because you're going to cover it inside and out with the pitch. Make it kind of waterproof as the ark floats along. And this is how you must make it. The length of the ark will be 300 cubits, the width of it 50 cubits, and the height of it 30 cubits. Make an opening 1 cubit below the top of the ark all around, and you must set the door of the ark on its side. Make it with a lower, a second, and a third story. I will bring a flood of waters on the earth to destroy all flesh, wherever there is the breath of life under heaven, and everything that is on the earth will die. But I will establish my covenant with you. You must go into the ark, you and your sons, and your wife, and your sons' wives with you. Bring every living thing of all flesh, 2 of every kind, into the ark, and keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female. Very important, because we're going to have more later on. Don't care if that rhinoceros identifies as a female. You need an actual male and an actual female. 2 of every kind of bird and every kind of animal and of every kind of creeping thing of the earth will come to you to be kept alive. So the animals are going to come up to him, which is convenient. I imagine that would be quite a task, running around trying to wrestle up a bunch of animals. Also, take with you of every kind of food that is eaten and gather it for yourself, and it will be food for you and for them. You're going to get the munchies over the course of this flood, right? Genesis 6:22, Noah did this. He did all that God commanded him. Okay, now we just looked at the dimensions of the ark, which is given in this glorious unit, the cubit. Let's take a look at what that would look like. I have brought together a couple of images and quotes that may be helpful to understanding the size of this monstrosity of an ark. The information that I found is from the Ark Encounter website. Now, the Ark Encounter is a ministry of Answers in Genesis, and they have built this giant structure that is based on the ark that we see in the Bible. Now, there are a couple of uncertainties about the ark. For one thing, if you take a look at this structure, it is shaped kind of like a boat, right? I tend to think that the ark was shaped more like a box, if you will. This is a good shape for a boat if you want to attach a giant sail or a motor to it or something and get it going in a direction, right? Noah didn't really have to navigate, though. He just needed to stay afloat. So if you built this thing in more of a box shape, it would actually be a little bit bigger than it is here. Also, I understand that if you go to the other side of it, it's kind of like a building. This thing is not actually meant to go afloat. It's off in Kentucky somewhere, so they're not going to get flooded. Anyhow, let's take a look at some of the information that the Ark Encounter website has for us. Okay, so they've actually built an ark to the appropriate proportions. There's a little bit of guesswork. Now, the unit of measurement that we keep seeing here is the cubit. What is a cubit? A cubit is an ancient measurement of length based on the distance from the elbow to the tip of the longest finger. This is a direct quote from the Ark Encounter website, and this happens to be a point where Ark Encounter and I are in conflict, because they have said that the cubit is an ancient measurement, and I think it needs to stay a current measurement. It was used in antiquity. I guess if you think about it, the Ark Encounter did not specifically say that the cubit is not to be used today. They just said that it was used in antiquity. So I guess I'll let them slide on that. So it's from the tip of the finger to the elbow. All right, that's a cubit. Well, how long is that? Different people are different sized, right? So if we convert to inches, we can go to a couple of different artifacts around antiquity to kind of guess what a cubit was. The Hebrew old cubit was 17 and a half inches. The Egyptian was 17.6. But there are different cubits, right? Some are longer, some are shorter. There's also the long cubit, if you will. So there's a Babylonian long, which is 19.8 inches, and the Egyptian long cubit is 20.6 inches. So whatever the standard elbow to fingertip that was being measured would probably fluctuate from person to person. So the Ark Encounter has estimated that the Hebrew long cubit would have been 20.4 inches. Okay? And that's the standard unit that they used for building this entire ark. Now, it says on their site here, if the 20.4-inch cubit accurately represented Noah's cubit, then Noah would have been approximately 6'3" tall. So that's the cubit that they used, which made the ark about 510 feet long and over 50 feet tall. Now, if you use the smaller cubit, then you'll end up with a smaller ark. I tend to wonder if maybe Noah couldn't have been even bigger than this. So 6'3". I'm somewhere between 6'2" and 6'7". It depends on which mugshot you're looking at. But if you look back a couple hundred years, it seems that everyone was a bit smaller than is standard today. Well, that probably has something to do with nutrition, right? You go to a museum and look at sets of clothes, sometimes you're like, oh my goodness, that's pretty small. I could never fit in that. Well, yeah, because you've been living in a 20th, 21st century diet, which gives you more calories, you're able to fill in a little bit better. So it could be that Noah was actually taller and stronger and mightier than I am. That's not a hard thing to fathom at all. In which case, his cubit could have been a bit longer, which would make the ark even bigger. Okay, this is all speculation. We can't be too sure, but the Ark Encounter folk used a 20.4-inch cubit, so that's the number that we're sticking with for now. So, how does this turn out? Right, this is what I love, because the Ark Encounter has illustrating this using a completely glorious rejection and disregard of the metric system. So, the ark is about 510 feet long. It would take nearly 1.5 football fields, American football, not that metric football that you see over in Europe, soccer, right? It's about 1.5 football fields to equal the ark's length. That's big enough that NASA could lay 3 space shuttles nose to nose on the ark's roof. People say Americans will measure with anything but the metric system. I think anything is better than the metric system, including NASA shuttles. This is excellent. All right. How about the height? The roof of the Noah's Ark was more than 50 feet from the ground, higher than a modern 4-story house. That's plenty of space for 3 extra tall inner decks, as the Bible describes, that we just saw here in the text, right? So there's not just one big room inside, you got 3 different levels. All right. The ark had the same storage capacity as about 450 standard semi-trailers. A standard livestock trailer holds about 250 sheep, so the ark had the capacity to hold at least 120,000 sheep, which is more than the biblically prescribed number of sheep that needed to get on the ark. Speaking of the Ark Encounter, over 3.1 million board feet of timber were used in the construction of the Ark Encounter, the one there in Kentucky. A board foot is 12 inches by 12 inches by 1 inch. In board feet, laid end to end, there's enough timber in the ark construction to go from Williamstown, Kentucky to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. That's a lot of wood. This is a very big structure, quite possibly the largest wooden ship ever made. Now, there have been other ships of other material that have been made bigger than this since then, but as far as wooden ships, this is the biggest one. Now, it is often argued that a wooden ship like that would twist apart and fall apart in the wind and the waves and everything, so it's not possible. I would disagree. Sure, we do have cases of big wooden ships getting all bent up and torn apart in storms. However, I think Noah could have had really good boat building technology. It's also possible that if he used a more boxy design for an ark rather than a one that needs to be able to navigate the sea, if it just needed to stay afloat, that could also um, contribute to the possibility of the boat staying there and not falling apart. Could also be God's provision that he kept the boat preserved through all that. Okay, so what did we see here in chapter 6? We see that fallen angels, likely, there are some other theories that could have been men, but I would tend to think it was fallen angels, came, started breeding with human women, and having this hybrid fallen angel human race that came about in a satanic ploy to thwart God's promise of the Messiah. In addition to this, man was becoming increasingly and increasingly corrupt, violent, and evil, because that's what man does when you leave him only to his conscience. So it got to the point where God was going to destroy the entire earth and save only a few. So God told Noah to build an ark to preserve Noah, his 3 sons, and their wives. So a total of 8 people. No, Emma Watson did not sneak aboard the ark, as you may have seen in that silly movie Noah that came out a few years ago. It was only 8 people and the animals. We'll look a bit more at that next time. And this is how God destroyed the world and preserved a few. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of the Thursday Show. Next time, we will pick up in Genesis chapter 7.